So, hello everyone, and welcome to our podcast. My name is JT Cunningham, your host, and I'd like to introduce you to Chloe and Holly, my other hosts.
Hello, I'm Chloe.
Hi, I'm Holly.
So, we are all in Introduction to World Politics here at Lehigh University. The reason that I decided to take this course was because last year I was binge watching the Netflix TV show called Madam Secretary, and it got me really interested in world politics. And I thought it would be a wonderful way for me to get myself out of the TV world and into the real world and learn more about what's going on with geopolitics across the globe.
Yeah, I took world politics because, well, honestly, it has nothing to do with my major, and I just have always found international relations and politics really interesting. And this would be kind of the only chance that I would get to take a class on this would be in college.
I took this class because I wanted to expand my knowledge of what's going on around the world, and I wanted to be a more informed voter. So I wanted to have as much information as possible so that going forward, I could formulate my own opinions and have actual knowledge on what's going on around the globe.
Yeah, Holly, I really agree with that point. A lot of times as Americans, we tend to focus a lot on domestic politics and ignore foreign relations. So it's a really good reason why you decided to take IWP.
Thanks.
So today we're going to be talking about a current conflict that is going on in the globe. It is the conflicts going on in the Sahel region in Western Africa. Does anyone want to talk about the historical context behind what these countries are, what challenges they've been facing over the past century or two?
So in history, we were talking a little bit about it before. There's been a lot of French active participation within Western Africa. And they were there for, a pretty long time. And then they decided to pull out of the Sahel region, and it left this like big open area for a bunch of corruption and or other countries to come in and kind of do what they wanted to do with the region. What do you think, JT?
Yeah, I agree with that very well. The best way I can describe the overall geopolitics of the region is the scars of colonialism healing. A lot of wounds, once they happen in the body, they get worse before they get better. So I do think that there is some hope in the long term for this region, but it is going to be a tumultuous path through democratization and recovery from historical colonialism. Another very important factor that I think we need to consider with this region is the overall poverty that engulfs all these countries. For example, Niger has a GDP per capita of only $670, and Mali has a little short of $900 per capita. These are some of the poorest places in the entire globe. Wherever there is poverty, oftentimes comes instability.
Yeah, I mean, with that, I also saw some facts just about how this region has the most growing population, and yet, like you said, the poorest countries. So, yeah, I think that will definitely impact the way that the government and citizens and other groups interact with each other.
I think in addition to that, when we were talking about the poverty, like Niger being $670 and like all the countries in this region, if we're going to take a historical approach at it, if we look at Germany right before World War II, the whole reason, or not the whole reason, but a big reason why Hitler was able to work his way up through the power ranks of Germany was because their citizens were so poor and their currency was so depleted because they were paying all their debts from World War One and all the casualties and whatnot, that it gave, evil people an opportunity to come in with bad intentions and rise to power and make all these choices because they were making false promises to people that had nowhere else to turn. So I think when you're that poor and you have no money and all you're worried about is survival and something that you like, if you hear a politician making these promises to you that your life is going to get better if you elect them. It looks, no matter where they come from, it looks promising and like a path forward. So you want to take a chance at that. And sometimes that gives corrupt people a path to power.
Yeah, I think that's very true. So, but the only difference is instead of there being politicians that people are turning to, it's more insurgent groups
Right.
and terrorist leaders.
Right.
And I think as enlightened Westerners, it is our first instinct to judge people for being terrorists because they're doing evil, terrible things throughout the world. But when we take a step back and look at the psychology of why these people, not their leaders, why the people are turning to these groups, it's a much more complex issue than it appears at the forefront.
Yeah.
I think that sums up very well the relevant historical context in the past about this region. But let's start to shift a little closer to the present. In 2012, that's when Mali suffered a coup d'etat that overthrew the government. The what's called ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, did oppose the coup d'etat, but they were not able to successfully reinstate power to the democratic president, and the military junta has been in influence ever since. And also in Niger, that's a much more recent conflict. It broke out about a year ago when, similarly, a coup d'etat overthrew the government and the military faction is in control. These two nations, along with Burkina Faso and Guinea, have all allied together in opposition of the more norm-following and democratically elected other countries in ECOWAS, and they've pledged that they would support each other if there were any military intervention.
Which goes back to something we've talked about before in class with alliances and power and all that, all those different complex type of dynamics. When people are grasping at straws a little bit and trying to survive, countries will turn towards each other, or different groups will turn towards each other to try to gain power.
Mm-hmm. But but the governments themselves and the insurgent groups aren't the only main actors. Chloe, I know before we started recording, we were talking a bit about the terrorist groups. Do you want to mention those?
Yeah. This kind of goes back to honestly what we were saying about the last question, with the Islamist groups, specifically Al Qaeda, and then what was the name?
Boko Haram.
Boko Haram. And yeah, these terrorist groups kind of arise because of just the corruption within the government, and we can obviously say that the terrorist groups are doing terrible things, but the government's failure to confront the separatist groups that threaten the state. I think we see, really just the insurgency of all these terrorist groups trying to take what they think is their own, whether that be land, religion, etc.
Right.
Mm-hmm. There's one other important actor that I feel a lot of the international news covering is not reporting on enough, but is still a very important factor to consider. How individual towns, because the national level government is just so weak in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. The national government is so weak, the individual towns turn towards self-help.
Yeah.
And they have, like, the mayor appoints someone to be a military leader of the people in that town to go out and make sure that the Islamists and the jihadists don't take over and kill the people and steal all of their things, especially for Christian regions and Christian people groups. They feel very threatened, especially because the Islamists want to impose a tax on them to try to influence them coercively to convert. So are there any other actors that we've forgotten to mention? Did we talk about...
Did we mention the Russian?
Yes, that's a very good one.
I mean, I was just going to bring up the Russian, Wagner, the Russian military. They came in to this region, and they kind of saw a opportunity, an opening for some power. And I feel, well, in my opinion, I feel like they're masking a little bit, like they kind of want to help, but in the past, Russia has created a reputation. They have a
Yes.
reputation for being very selfish and being kind of power hungry. So I think that they saw this as an opportunity to move in at the ground level and take over some countries and get themselves into this part of the world where we really only saw like the French be in the past. So, and they're not doing a phenomenal job of being in the region.
For me, that's very scary how Russia, I think we can safely say that Russia, controlled by Putin, is one of the worst actors on a state level in the world. And it's very scary to have them expanding their influence.
Mm-hmm.
So we've talked about some of the history, some of the actors. Now we can move on to some of the interests and interactions that these groups have. The democratically elected regimes that still exist or have been forced out of power in the region do want to maintain a liberal, peaceful order, out of relatively benign intentions, but they're opposed by the Islamists who want to have a caliphate and institute Sharia law, which would be terrible for human rights in the region, especially for women and non-Muslim minorities.
Right.
And then insurgent groups have a wide variety of different things that they want.
Yeah, and before we were talking about just the idea of the divisibility of all of this, and how, especially in class, we talked about how some groups can claim that something is indivisible, especially like an extremist group. And we see that a lot of this really could become a divisible good, whether that be land or, the extremist groups taking it a little too far when it comes to the idea of religion and pushing that into certain areas of the region. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that plays into just how extreme these conflicts have become.
And deeply rooted.
Yeah.
It's hard, especially when you bring in like religion. It's so hard to change people's minds because it's at the core, like so much of what they believe that it's really hard to change anybody's mind when they think that they are like morally correct or obligated to like land or how people should believe in like God or anything like that. It's really hard to change their minds on that or allow them to budge a little bit. So I think it makes it even harder because people are more like locked into their own sense of reality.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that, so there was this one interview that I listened to while preparing to have this discussion. It was a man who's from the Sahel region, and he's been working with civil society groups, advocacy groups, and national governments since 2012 when conflict first broke out in Mali. He said that the main institution is obviously war and violence that people are turning to. But since then, he's been able to, by cooperating with a lot of groups, bring some dialogue into the mix. He said that at the beginning, the governments just kept saying, we don't negotiate with terrorists, period. And the terrorists that he spoke with said, we're not going to bargain about our God. They were both hardliner positions. But through a lot of very hard work, he's been able to get people to sit down and have dialogue and conversations. And people have begun to very, very slowly, very, very slowly soften their stances and come incrementally close to maybe finding a peaceful resolution sometime in the distant future.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. So those are our institutions, interactions, and the interests that we've talked about. The next item that we have on our agenda, I believe, is to talk about some of the theories that apply to this conflict. Out of realism, institutional liberalism, and constructivism, what theoretical framework do you both think best defines what's happening here? Since I'm conflicted.
I think it depends on from whose perspective we're looking at. Like, I think if we're looking at the civilians of this region, I think that they're probably actually very peaceful people, but or so like because they're so poor. But if we're looking at like the corruption of like their governments or other groups that have come in, I think that would be
Like a realist
Yeah.
view.
mm-hmm.
So you think that the people just want peace and they're not even thinking about this?
I
But the
think-
governments, it's more of a balance of power.
Mm-hmm.
I don't even know if it's necessarily peace. It's more of just basic human rights.
Yeah,
They just want to get through the day without getting shot.
Yes.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Mhm.
Yeah.
They're just
Yeah.
trying to survive.
Yeah,
Like-
I see the realism argument. That's like survival, the main goal of the state and the main goal of the people of the state.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that constructivism also does offer some solutions, especially because the lines are oftentimes drawn on ideology/religion,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and those do define a lot of the conflict.
Yeah.
I guess I was just thinking, even in the sense if we're looking at realism, that a lot of these issues arise because of the lack of like strong central government. And
Amen.
because of that, like groups are
Mhm.
able to rise up, and we see that with like the extremist groups. And there's just a lot of competition among certain resources and ideologies, and other countries even wanting to get involved specifically to take advantage of these resources, which just turns into an endless cycle of poor government and extracting resources from these places.
Yeah.
Since that is what France had done
Yeah.
for such a long time,
So
and that once France left, other actors try to do the same thing.
Yeah.
It's because there were never really, at least since the advent of colonialism, strong institutions in place.
Yeah.
Good. So I think it's also very important for us to talk about some future resolutions
Mhm.
that we individually would suggest if we ruled the world. But before we get to that, it's also very important to think about the current solutions that diplomats are attempting to arrive at, so we can understand the context by which we give our suggestions. The most conventional approach is a military one, which has not fully been attempted with military intervention because all of the juntas have like allied together. The other African states are reluctant to invade and give back control to the democratically elected leaders. So what they've been trying to do is a level of diplomatic pressures, such as imposing very, very harsh economic sanctions, closing off travel, and not letting people cross the border for anything. But as we can see, that has not exactly been working,
Right.
especially since the region is so poor already. You can't take much away from someone that they don't already have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think. Well, I don't know. I think that if we were going to talk about like a theoretical solution, because I don't know how much of this would actually be able to be applied to the real world, but I think that like in theory, leaders around the whole world should probably come together to try to come up with a solution to finally get a stable, semi-stable government in these countries. And then economically, like you said, like they're just so poor that you need to find a way to allow these people to like live more than off the bare bones. They're just so underdeveloped as countries compared to other countries around the world that I think it's like even if we just educate, like if they just got more educated, that would help them to go get jobs and all this other stuff. I think it starts of like strengthening a actual good government, keeping out other groups that don't necessarily have the best of intentions, and then educating the people at the root.
Yeah, I think that both of your kind of suggestions are both very true. We could have a like direct military intervention from powerful world leaders. Since France has, since I think it was 2022, formally pulled out of Mali. They're not being involved in it at all. France, the United States, Russia even could establish temporary peace in the region, but that it's like putting a band-aid on the solution. The real solution to the problem is to find like long-term economic growth and development things so that people can be educated, have stable jobs, and find meaning out of their life and peace for themselves and their families, that they don't need to turn to insurgency.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I guess. Sorry.
No,
The
sorry.
only
you.
thing that I think of when I like the idea of increasing the economy and like the overall development is, well, obviously they would need some sort of like humanitarian aid, and I wonder like if other states would even be willing to help out a lot in this, simply because they get to reap the benefits of them having a weak government. Like they get to extract their resources.
So do you think that like since Russia is in, like Wagner is in that region right now, that maybe they, instead of deploying military force, that they should also be sending money,
yeah.
like
But I
you
almost
said,
wonder if like if states would be willing to do that. I think it's more because like you see like that the UN is involved in this, but it hasn't done very much yet.
Yeah.
Since all that the UN did was the Security Council
Yeah.
adopt a resolution saying, no, you guys should stop having all these
Yeah.
insurgencies. Please stop.
Yeah.
But then Russia goes effectively against their own vote on the Security Council and allows Wagner to go in and continue instigating the conflict.
Yeah. So that's why it's like I think it sounds nice, and obviously would be helpful if other countries were able to aid in their development. I just don't know if I necessarily see that happening.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't see the United States getting involved in any way, shape, or form anytime soon. Before starting this project, I had no idea about this conflict going on in Western Africa. And I personally like to consider myself a well-informed citizen. So if I'm not thinking about this issue, there's no way that policymakers in Washington are considering it.
Yeah.
And now that Donald Trump has been elected to office, who is adopting a much more isolationist standpoint, not to say he's an absolute isolationist, but he's more reluctant to get involved in foreign conflict. I don't see America getting involved.
Yeah, it's true. I wouldn't see the United States getting involved anytime soon. I think especially after Joe Biden making the decision to try to pull out of the Middle East.
With Afghanistan.
Yeah, I really don't see the United States focusing on really any other country other than Israel, probably.
And to a limited extent, Ukraine.
Yeah. Yes, to a limited extent, Ukraine too, I agree. But I think that they're going to be really more focused on themselves at this point in time, especially with the recent new election, so I don't know,
And if you're like looking specifically into what this region could do itself, I was looking at the idea of counterterrorism, but I don't know if that really solves anything because, like we said before, terrorist groups are bad, but what are the people that are supporting it for? And if the government just suppresses that, it's not going to get any better.
So the real solution is sustainable development.
Yeah.
Yes. I think we can all come to terms that that is the best thing that everyone, I hope to say everyone really wants. Even the evil terrorist leaders do still want prosperity for themselves, their families, the members of their religious community. The governments want that. If we're able to, hopefully through dialogue, remind all of the relevant actors that they do have a common interest in maintaining peace in the region, there is still hope for the Sahel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any closing thoughts?
No, I think we hit on everything.
So great. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Extra Credit Assignment Podcast with JT, Holly, and Chloe. We hope that you join us again soon, and have a great day.
Bye.
Copyright 2024. JT Cunningham, Holly Lovett, and Chloe Domingues. All rights reserved. Unauthorized reproduction or display of this content is illegal. All music and musical recordings used in this production are in the public domain.